start us off and then turn it over to Lita. We've been arguing about who should take the brunt of the time. And I thought for really to say Lita should.
This is all I have. That's all. And she is the authority, truly.
That's not true.
It is.
Okay, Jane Elizabeth Manning James. I'm assuming that most of you have heard of her, which is so gratifying. So I've just made that assumption and then congratulated you all. But it's so gratifying because when I encountered her name in maybe 1998, and it was in a series of events where there was, I had said I wanted to be a writer, and I, had published some books and other things, and just realized this isn't that big of a deal. This is not making a difference. So I went to the temple and at a certain point just said, give me something to do with my talent. And I was reading in some books a while later and saw the name Jane Manning James and thought, oh, Black Mormon pioneer, I could totally do that. Right, look at me. So of course I couldn't do it alone. And so when that all happened, which was just an amazing thing, we can trace it down to a very particular day that I met Darius Gray, because it's traced to a miracle, and I know the date of that miracle. So I'm not going to detail that now because we're talking about Jane. But when I first heard of Jane, and Darius and I got together and ended up writing 3 books and making a documentary, when we did our first book, they didn't have any pictures of Jane. So they Deseret Book put a picture of a Black woman from that century. Turned out that some historians knew who she was and said, oh, that's not Jane. Well, at this point, we have pictures of Jane. So I'm going to show you one that came from her great-great-grandson. Have you seen this one, Lita? Mm-hmm. So he has this in his home in Los Angeles. I'll maybe just tell briefly about how we came in contact with Louis Duffy. And I think after that, I'm going to have you do your part, okay, and then take as much time as you want. So Darius and I were working on the books. I had done a play about Jane called I Am Jane, and I think maybe a total, possibly 2,000 people in the whole world had seen my play. We did it in Springville, Utah. So meanwhile, Louis Duffy, great-great-grandson of Jane Manning James, knows his ancestors' heritage. He knows about the story of his ancestor. He's told he was a flight attendant, and he would tell other flight attendants, oh, my ancestors are Mormon pioneers. And they'd say, no, I think you need to write down. I don't know who they are. So he looks out of his apartment one day. He's in Watts in Los Angeles and sees 2 LDS missionaries and has never seen Mormon missionaries in his neighborhood. Runs out and says, hey, when you're done, come and talk to me. So they're Mormon missionaries. They went, and afterwards, Louis said, my ancestors are Mormon missionaries. And they didn't say, probably not. One of them said, I just saw a play about this Black pioneer, and he told the story of what we had written. And I had pulled Jane's words as often as I could. I put her own words in that play. And Louis recognized it almost immediately. That was my ancestor. What is the play? How can I find out about it? He looked up, he went online. We are in the age of internet. So he could just plug in, I Am Jane. I don't think he even got my full name, but he found the books that we had done. He ordered them express mail, delivered, the next day from Deseret Book, and just read them all immediately. Within a few days, he had the whole trilogy read. And then he sent us a letter, Margaret Blair Young and Darius Gray, Genesis Group, Salt Lake City, Utah, and it got to us. Somehow it got to us. So we were I remember being at Darius's dining room table, and we recognized the name. We actually did know who her posterity were, but we had a bad experience with one of her descendants who was quite bitter about some things that her father had suffered. And so we kind of thought there's probably a dead end. But there wasn't. So because we were no longer looking, it was put into our hands. And Louis came into our lives. And he actually, I will be with him because we're showing the film that we made in the Congo in Los Angeles for the Pan-African Film Festival. And that's where he is. So of course, we will be spending some time together. So he had this picture of Jane. He wasn't sure that it was Jane for sure, I'll show you another picture in a moment after Lita talks, and that's the one that we're the most familiar with. We took this to a sculptor and said, we are trying to identify this woman. This woman we know is Jane, and that came from the Church History Museum, but not until after our book was published. And so the sculptor measured nose, jawbone, ear, the space between nose, lip, several measurements, and said, yes, this is Jane. And I called Louis and said, it's Jane. And he said, I knew it. Every time I passed, it was like she was saying, I am your ancestor, I am Jane. So these lovely little ways that Jane has become a part, really, I think, of Latter-day Saint culture. We'll mention the movie Jane and Emma that the wonderful Melissa Leilani Larson scripted. But in so many ways, Jane has been brought into our sensibilities. And one is through Lita. I read an article that Lita wrote about on Jane Manning James. Let me see what this is Lita with the official portrait of Jane. And then I'll just introduce this and turn it over to Lita. When we were doing the sculpture, this is at the Salt Lake Cemetery, we were doing the sculpture of Jane James giving 2 pounds of flour to Eliza Lyman Partridge. And to choose who we would have pose for the sculptor, we chose Lita. So if you look at the image of Jane Manning Jane, that's Lita. And I'm going to turn it over to Lita.
Okay, so this is, this is just, I'm coming up 2 times. This is the first time I'm here to share some thoughts and feelings about this wonderful woman. My sister Margaret has blessed me with the privilege to share my feelings of love for Sister Jane. That's what I call her, Sister Jane. And every time I do, I feel she just comes. She comes. If it wasn't for Margaret, I would not have come to love and know her the way that I do. I've been blessed to lend my voice, my face, to her majestic narrative on a number of occasions over the years. So much so that her voice at times becomes a part of mine. And yes, I use the word majestic. Why? Why do I use that word? Because when I began to think about what I needed to say about Jane today, that is the word that came to me as I thought and reflected on her, the influence she's had in my life. Majestic, meaning beautiful, powerful, or causing great admiration and respect. That is how I feel about Sister Jane. Margaret taught a class at BYU years back. Remember? Was it called Blacks in the Mormon Culture? Black in the LDS Church?
We did something like that, yeah.
Yeah, remember, Kevin?
Yes.
So, she and Darius, I'm not sure if he did, but there was an actual class on campus called Blacks in the LDS Culture, and we were like, what? And so we went, and it was kind of obscure and held like on a weird day and at night. I don't know. It was just, but if you cared, you would show up. So anyway, learning about Jane's dream of the prophet Joseph, her commitment to where he was, to see him, what she was willing to do, then what she persisted in doing when it became more than she had anticipated. One, walking over 800 miles to get to him. That truly affected me. There is majesty in that. I was drawn to her spirit through her own words. My faith in the gospel of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is strong today. Nay, it is, if possible, stronger than it was the day I was first baptized. I pay my tithes and offerings, keep the word of wisdom. I go to bed early and arise early. I try in my feeble way to set a good example to all. I hear her voice. And as I read those words, I thought, that was me. The spirit of Jane seeps into my heart, and she has been there ever since.
Beautiful.
That's You know, the way that Darius and I did our books was I would craft them, and then he would breathe the soul into them. We would, because I'm a linguist daughter, I was trained in how to do translation, so I would have him read what I had written, and he would just automatically put it into the language he knew, which was the soul. And that was how those books, that's why they sound the way they do. It's not me, I just put the words down there, but words without spirit don't do a whole lot. That's what Lita just did for me. So the spirit of Jane is here, and we will simply pay tribute for the rest of the time. I'm going to tell you about the little miracle of this sculpture that Lita posed for. For our sculptor is Leroy Transbuild. I follow him on Facebook, and I'm looking at the magnificent works he's creating now. But there is quite a story to this piece. That, by the way, is Louis Duffy, me, and Darius Gray. This was the day we also erected monuments to Jane's children who had died and didn't have burial plots, and so we created a monument for those. But for the sculpture itself, the little plaque, when Leroy began sculpting, he was really caught by this description in Jane's life story. When they started, it's the whole family, it's not just Jane. She's got her mother, her brother, sister-in-law, there are 8 of them on their way to Nauvoo, Illinois. They go from Wilton, Connecticut to Buffalo, New York. That's not a problem. But at Buffalo, they put their clothes in their trunks on the ship, and then they are denied passage. And then Jane says, we walked a distance of over 800 miles. We walked until the soles of our shoes wore out, and you could see the whole print of our feet in blood on the ground. We knelt in prayer. We asked God, the Eternal Father, to heal our feet, and our feet were healed forthwith. We went on our way, rejoicing, singing, and praising God as we went. When Darius and I wrote that particular paragraph, and I said, so now, should we portray the soreness of the feet? And he said, Margaret, God healed their feet. Did you not read that? So they're just, yeah, they have faith. They just go on their way now. And that honestly is one of the lessons of faith that I have learned from Darius Gray and his family, because I got to feel the spirit of his mother, who had taught him about Jesus before Darius joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And that was really how he stayed through some very, very difficult experiences. So Leroy loved that paragraph and thought that he would depict these black saints barefoot walking this long distance. And every time he would try to sculpt it, he would get a headache. And finally called me and said, that's not the one. That's not what I should be sculpting. And he said, I think I'm going to do Jane at the doorway of Eliza Partridge Lyman. I had given him the little part of Eliza's journal, which we wouldn't know about without Eliza. She had written, she is so fun, because she's so honest. If she's somebody that, kind of like Jane Austen, you can read the little bit of a bite in what she's saying. So she comes to Utah and she writes, I do not think our enemies need envy us this locality. I do not believe they will follow us here. And then her husband is called on a mission to California. We're in gold rush time, the 49ers. And she says, my husband with Porter Rockwell and lists others has been called on a mission. May the Lord bless and protect them on their way. He left me with no flour in the house nor anywhere to get it. And then 2 weeks later, Jane James, the colored woman, brought me 2 pounds of flour, it being about half of what she had. That became the symbol to me. I've told Lita and Kevin, the Joseph story has called me over and over and over again, the story of Joseph sold by his brothers. And I've thought, this is Joseph giving grain to her sister, who had, we don't know exactly how Eliza treated her. All we have is that one sentence in Eliza's journal talking about Jane James. We do know that they both had babies at the same time in winter quarters. Eliza's son lived for only a few months and then died. And we suspect that Jane was probably there with the other pioneers who went to sing to Eliza to help her through that time. As we've considered what their friendship must have been, they met in the mansion house there must have been something significant that bound them for all of that time. So we arranged to have Leroy do the sculpture, and we okayed his idea of what he was going to do. And we found granite from the same quarry that the temple granite was used in Salt Lake. So it was going, because Jane had longed to go to the temple and was not able to during her life, not to be endowed. She did do baptisms for the dead. But the idea of having that sculpture on stone from the temple quarry was especially significant. So the morning arrived when I was going to go pick the plaque up at the foundry, and then Darius was waiting at the quarry with the stone, and we were going to turn everything over to them, and they would get it to the cemetery. So I went to the foundry, and the process, as you probably know, is to take the clay piece and immerse it in a kiln, fire it so it gets bronzed. So I go to the foundry, and Leroy's there kind of pacing, and I said, how did it turn out? He said, well, we should talk. And I said, is everything okay? He said, well let's go inside. Did it turn out all right? Why don't you sit down? And at this point, you know something's wrong. And I just waited, and he said, so I wasn't going to really tell you this because it hardly ever happens, but, well, it exploded. Mm-hmm. And our programs were out. We had David B. Haight, whose grandfather, Isaac Haight, was in Jane's company, was going to preside at our ceremony. Lita and Kevin were there. John Groberg, my uncle, was going to be there, and Alexander Morrison, who presided over the Genesis group, was going to be there. We could not recall the invitations. So Leroy said, I have a solution. I've got a copy. I can paint it bronze. Nobody will know. And I said, okay, we have no choice here. So I drove up to tell Darius what had happened. This must have been pre-cell phone, because I didn't call. I just drove up. So about the year 2000. And we met on the road, and I rolled my window down and said, before I say anything, just know it's going to be all right. And he said, what happened? And I said, well, it exploded. This is the most beautiful expression. For those who know Darius, you can just imagine him. Well, it exploded, but we're going to have an imitation. We'll have a second one. And I talked to Leroy later on that day. He went up to the cemetery. It was raining. And he knelt before the stone where he was going to place this plaque and prayed for the skies to clear, and they cleared. And then he just slathered glue on that, the second, the copy that nobody would know was not the real thing, so that he could put it on that stone, and it stuck. So we were there the next day to dedicate. We had, we really didn't tell anybody. Did I tell you, Lita? I don't remember telling you back then. Yeah. This was not news that we circulated. So it was the stone that we knew would be replaced was put on the sculpture. It was dedicated, and then I talked to Leroy and said, well, this would be nice because then we can donate the stone. When you replace it with the real thing, we can donate that one to the Church History Museum. And they said, oh no, I'm going to have to chip it off. It's because I put so much glue on there to be sure that with the rain it was okay. And you can imagine, a month later, when the stone was ready, he called and said, you're never going to believe this. It came off in one piece. So we did give the sculpture to the Church History Museum, and they pull it out periodically. It was actually, the last time I saw it was on the eve of my father's death, when Darius and I gave a presentation at the Church History Museum, and that had been pulled out for us to have, really in a lot of ways for me, a symbol of Jane, her charity in her life, her willingness to serve even those who were maybe not always kind to her, and the fact that it hadn't worked out the way we had imagined it would. It had not ever imagined that things would explode. And I think in Jane's life, things happened that she could not have imagined. When she and her family finally arrived in Nauvoo, and again, I have Darius to thank for the instructions. He said they would not have gone to the front door. The people who were Black would go around to the back door, to the kitchen, to ask if there were any spare food that they might have. So we portrayed them, knowing that they didn't have their clothes, that they had been on this 800-mile trek without the clothes that they had packed. And barefoot for a long, 800 miles, they probably bound their feet with something, but here they are at the back door of the mansion house, and Jane says that Emma comes to the door and says, come in, all of you. That's not the first thing that happened when they got to Nauvoo, and she only gives us one sentence. She does not dwell on the difficult thing that happened. Because when the people in Nauvoo saw this black family, they met the Mannings with much rebuff. Those are the words she uses, much rebuff. So they're not thrilled to have this black family there. And then Orson Hyde takes them to the mansion house, and they are greeted by Emma in that way, and taken into the parlor. And not just that, but Joseph Smith says to the people in the parlor, we've got guests coming. And so the fact that Jane mentions, they go into the parlor, and then Joseph said, well, tell me about your journeys. And they start talking about what's happened, and Jane in the history says, I cannot remember everything because I'm old now. She was 80. And I can't remember everything that happened. But I told him everything that had happened, and Dr. Bernheisel was at his side, and Joseph said, Dr. Bernheisel, what do you think? Is that enough faith? And Dr. Bernheisel slapped his knee and said, I think it is. And then this line, you are among friends. That was the promise that he gave. So again, just kind of think of that metaphor of what happened to this beautiful stone, and the fact that it ended up, that it was difficult today, and that we didn't necessarily tell people what was going on, but that we ended up with 2 of these little monuments. So some of the most poignant things that we have from Jane, and she becomes especially important because we have not only her history that she recorded with Elizabeth J.D. Roundy writing it down, but we have the letters that she wrote to church authorities. I'm going to just show you the next piece. This is the play, I Am Jane, that we did. This young man right here, Adam Baird, played Joseph Smith. And as we performed the play, it was for the Mormon History Association in St. George. We performed the play, and Adam had he was from St. George, so his family had come. And after we had an afternoon performance and then an evening performance. After the afternoon performance, he met with his family and then came back sobbing and said, I just found out Eliza Partridge is my ancestor. Maybe I'm here because of what Jane did for my family. It became a deeply personal story to him. This is our production of Jane. I wanted to show the photobomb by Emmett Gill. He played Elijah Abel. So this is, I periodically at BYU just broke rules without necessarily knowing I was breaking rules. So at one point, we felt very strongly that the brother are not to know this story. So I saw no problem at all with just sending a personal invitation to President Uchtdorf and did. And then my dean called me in and said, did you know that you're not supposed to invite apostles to our events? No. And this was the second time I had gotten in trouble for something just like that. And I said, do you periodically have to have phone calls about me? But I got a call the day of this performance saying we need to be sure we have 4 seats. We have somebody, and I said, is it somebody that others will recognize? Oh, yes. So we're next door, in the room next door. Everybody's warming up and getting in their costumes. And President Uchtdorf opens the door and walks down the step and says, is there room for me in the cast? And I said, yes, we need an airline pilot. But the really significant thing, it was a lovely performance that night. This is Josie, who played Jane in our BYU performance. And she did a beautiful job. After the performance, Sister Uchtdorf came to me and said, you must keep writing these plays. You must keep writing these. And because I know there are other writers here, I think that's not just for me, but all of us. There are things we need to do to keep these stories told, to continue to unfold the stories and tell them. President Uchtdorf had a more lengthy response. He told me that he had gone to Mobile, Alabama, was it? Or I think it was Mobile for flight training, and had seen segregated bathrooms. This is in the 50s. it was stunning to him to see colored only, white only. And of course, his country had been through terrible, terrible consequences of what I call tribalism. And so he had particular understanding of how serious what he was seeing was. And he said what I don't think that I was necessarily the first person to hear it, but when he said it again in the priesthood session, as my husband reported, I recognized this is going to be a theme, and these were the words: the restoration continues. I heard those words the first time with President Uchtdorf the night of that play, but I've heard them many times since then. We're not finished. And the journey, by the way, of the race issues that we've been dealing with, certainly for all the time I've been a Latter-day Saint. I was born in 1955, baptized by my father in 63. We lived in Indiana at the time when I was baptized. And we moved to Chicago the next year, and I was aware there were 2 black boys in my class, my 4th grade class, and I was aware that my teacher mistreated them. I was aware because it made me deeply uncomfortable. And I'm so glad that I knew that I knew it was wrong. And when I came back to Utah and heard some overt racism, sadly from a seminary teacher, I knew that was wrong. And I talked to my dad about it, and I am so grateful that my father said, that is wrong. That is wrong. We had a home where people from all cultures were welcome. My father was a linguist, so we had people from Ecuador, Peru, generally South American, but Dad continued to expand to different continents. He didn't go to Africa with me except in spirit, because when I was preparing my first trip to the Congo, I said I would normally ask my husband to give me the blessing before I leave, but Dad, I'm going to have you do it this time. Dad was in the last 2 years of his life at that point, and he gave me a beautiful blessing certainly we didn't know what would happen. We certainly didn't realize that we would actually get to start the cinema industry in the Congo. It's just been the most astounding thing. But he knew that his daughter was able to live in third world countries and that she could learn languages because he had raised that daughter to do that. Then I said, I don't know what kind of permission. We knew that he wasn't going to be around. He was on dialysis, had been for about a decade. I said, we don't know what kind of permission you're going to need to help us in Africa, Dad, but we need you. And he said, I don't know what I'll need to do, but I'll do whatever I can to be with you there. My first trip there in 2014, I felt the presence of angels. I don't know if my father was there, but I felt it so strongly, and it stayed with me for 2 weeks after I returned. Just 2 weeks. I think that's so interesting that it wasn't permanent. For 2 weeks, I could feel the sort of being surrounded, and my temple experiences were different because of that. I could feel things that I had not felt. And 2 weeks after, I remember I was in Seattle, and I ran out of gas in a rented car on the way to the airport. And I said, angels, I will need some help now. And I realized, wait a minute, I don't know if they follow me to Seattle. And that was sort of my first expression of doubt. And I think that was the last time I really had a sense of that. We felt angels with us as we did Jane's story in every venue. It comes with so much difficulty. And every black member of our cast who participated had been through things in their own lives that just would break your heart. Let me go to the next slide. President Uchtdorf, beautiful Harriet, Emmett, and our Josie. The restoration continues. We did a documentary of Jane Manning James with footage they were going to use for a commercial, but there were still some controversies at that time and some nervousness about the stories that we were telling because they got quite uncomfortable. I don't know everything that happened, but the commercial was called off and they just gave us our footage. So I got 3 sisters who had all played Jane, Lita, Tamu Smith, and Denise Cutler, and we did a recording of each of them telling Jane's story. I will say that Lita sang. I was going to bring the DVD. I was told that they didn't have a DVD player there, so it's at the Baird's house. I just, without asking Lita much at all, I just said, do you think you could sing I'm a Child of God? I noticed that she paused for a moment and then said, sure. She hadn't sung for how long?
I don't even know. I don't know.
It had been, there was some sickness or something.
I lost my voice. I
Yeah.
got sick and I didn't have a voice. I did not have a voice.
So I didn't know that. We set her up, I'm so sorry that we don't have a DVD to show you. We set her up in this beautiful window. The shot is gold, and Lita, beautiful Lita, is sitting there, and she does this song, I am a child of God. Just magnificent. When we did I Am Jane, the run that future missionary saw in Springville, Utah, we got all of our children up, black members of the cast, white members of the cast, Latino, we all had our children come up on stage and sing I Am a Child of God. To me, that is the message that I want to communicate before I communicate everything and anything else. That's the song that is the first to be translated when the gospel goes anywhere. If there's a new language, that is the song that gets done. Jane and Emma, I've only seen Jane and Emma once. I think the acting is, Danielle is just a spectacular actor, and Melissa is one of our very best playwrights, Melissa Leilani Larson. Any responses from the rest of you who have maybe seen it more than I have?
Who has seen
Oh, some of you have not seen it? Well then, good. How nice that I can show you this. It is available. It is available I think it's still on iTunes. Deseret is moving from DVD to streaming right now, so this will be in their streaming service as they amp up to that. But it imagines Jane and Emma at the time when Joseph was killed. And Danielle, like I say, I wish if I had known that people hadn't seen it, I would have brought the trailer. And then this one, Jane James, Your Sister in the Gospel, is written by a non-Mormon scholar. So this is where we are now in 2020. When Darius and I started working, it was 1998, and Deseret Book did not have a picture of Jane Manning James to put on the cover of our first novel. By the time we finished our work, and I consider that all of the work that we did, including a couple of documentaries, and a lot of essays, and a lot of meetings, especially for Darius. What I say in secret, meaning I can tell you but don't tell him, is that I believe my real purpose in those books was to position Darius so that he could have conversations that needed to be had. I think that I was tangential, that he needed to be positioned. He was the Genesis president. I maybe will. What's our time, Jody? How much time do we have?
20.
Okay, then I will tell you the story of meeting Darius and the miracle that happened there.
Can you explain to some people they may not have a chance
Oh,
to see it?
thank you, Kevin. I do this a lot where I just assume that people have the context. So Genesis Group, you have a Genesis Group in Arlington. I don't know how it's doing. I was here when it was organized. The Genesis Group was established in 1971 because there were 3 black men, Gene Orr, Ruffin Bridgeforth, Darius Gray, who had a very serious problem. The priesthood restriction was in place. So at age 12, the sons of these men would basically leave. Their white buddies would be ordained to the priesthood and start having priesthood classes. What happened to the young black kids? Well, nothing, they left. So Darius, Gene, and Ruffin sent letters asking to have a conversation. This was, some of us are old enough to remember the presidency of Joseph Fielding Smith. This was when he was president of the church, 1971. And he assigned 3 junior apostles to meet with these 3 men. Their names were Boyd K. Packer, Thomas S. Monson, and Gordon B. Hinckley. They met twice a month, over 6 months. And then there was an unscheduled meeting where they were just told to show up, and President Hinckley, who was in charge, he had seniority, said, we are going to form a support group. So the Genesis Group of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was formed October 8th, 1971, with Ruffin Bridgeforth as its president, Darius Gray as first counselor, Eugene Orr as second counselor. It struggled. It was very difficult to get things going. At a certain point, Darius was working with the young men to do basketball. That was a way he could, whether they were coming to church or not, he could get them to come on the basketball team. Darius was working at KSL, so he had a friend, Paul James, who was doing the sports casting on KSL. So there was a deal with Paul James that if these kids could get through the regionals, if this is when we did state basketball, they would be spotlighted on KSL. Well, sad things happened, and when the people who could have given permission were out of town, the black team was disqualified. That actually sent Darius into a little period of inactivity. That was so difficult. He had worked so hard. Darlene?
So I have a question for you. So was it originally just for young men, or was it for all black men?
No, Genesis was for everybody.
Okay.
In fact, I'll maybe go into a little more detail of that. So Jean's wife she was the secretary who recorded everything. Darius got divorced during that time, so he went through a divorce and had that terrible experience with the basketball team that just really disrupted his life. But he's another one of explosion, but the Lord has other plans. So I believe that the Lord had his eye on Darius from the time of his birth, before his birth, when his mother was threatening miscarriage and called in the Pentecostal sisters to anoint and bless her womb. And they did that, and it was Darius who was born, and I'm not allowed to tell you what year. But he then, although he kept trying to back away, he kept being called back in, including this period of inactivity, where the priesthood revelation came June 8, 1978. He was not active at that time. You maybe didn't know that. That's not something that is broadcast a whole lot. So Ruffin Bridgeforth was very active at the time, and Boyd K. Packer went to Ruffin's ward and said, "Have you been ordained to the priesthood?" And Ruffin said, "I have not." And President Packer said, "Let's take care of that right now." And gave him a blessing and ordained him to the office of a high priest. And then Ruffin, whose wife was declining, said, "Would you now give a blessing to my wife?" And President Packer said, "No, you will give the blessing to your wife." So that happened. Lucille Bankhead, who was the granddaughter of Green Flake, who was one of the 3 colored servants, as they're referred to on the Brigham Young Monument, was the Relief Society president for Genesis. And she was the one who found the life history of Jane Manning James. She hired somebody to search through church records, and they found it, and that was how they did the temple endowment. I'll tell you that story too. So in 1978, Linda K. Newell wrote a story about Jane Manning James. Nobody had heard of Jane at that point. We are different now. Before we mention Jane's name, how many had heard of Jane? Pretty much a few of you had not, but I think she's become certainly much better known than she was in 78. So Linda wrote an article on Jane in the Ensign, and then wanted to do Jane's temple work after the 78 revelation. So it's 1979, and she calls church offices to see if she can't do the temple work for Jane James, and is told, if you'd called last week, the answer would have been no. But as of this week, we have a new policy that you can do the work for special friends. We're going to count Jane James as your special friend. So Lucille was there, descendant of Green Flake. Reverend Bridgeforth was there. Darius was not. People who you may know, Ron Esplin was there, and he let me read all of his journals so that I could see everything that had happened in that temple ceremony. But Linda, a white woman, served as proxy for Jane Manning James. Susan Easton Black also did the work later on, but Linda was the first one to do it. We had some duplication. But I've thought about that as a white woman doing Black history. The word appropriation is a really big word right now. And I've been extremely aware of what stories do I actually have the right to tell. Can I serve as proxy for Jane Manning James, who had a life with a context I can't even understand, who when they were traveling to Nauvoo, they were stopped by a sheriff who demanded their free papers. They had not been born slaves, so they didn't have any free papers to show. But the fact that that could happen when you're on your way to a certain destination, that's a context that I had absolutely no familiarity with. But I fully believe that through exactly what we've been talking about, what Lita and Kevin just did the last session, through empathy, through the empathetic imagination, as we imagine, expand our hearts wide as eternity, we come to understand another person, even if they are from a different tribe, even if they are from a different political persuasion. There are so many ways to divide us. And the message of the Savior is there are no ites among his children. We are all co-heirs with Jesus Christ of all that the Father hath. So we bring in a white woman who's not LDS, and she tells the story of Jane Manning James. She's speaking to a different audience. When Darius and I did our work, we read a novel. So we created the dialogue. We had to imagine it. When Lewis reported his review, he said, I think you got it pretty close. I think I could really hear her speak. He complained about some people in the third book because he had known them. By the time we did the third book, we were writing about people who we could listen to recordings of them. And he said, I think you're too nice to Monroe. And so I did. I actually made some changes. We revised the trilogy at one point because I saw that we'd gotten some things wrong because we were really new at this history thing. That things were not, we did not know things when we started the book. In fact, I created a scene of Darius Gray. I didn't tell him at the beginning, but I always knew he would be a character in the book. And it was just a question of how do I persuade him? And that, it worked. When I put his ancestor, Lewis Gray, who lived in Missouri, Marshall, Missouri, when I put him in the book, I knew that it meant Darius would be in the book. So we wrote a scene that had not happened when we published our first novel, where Darius is at the dedication of the Nauvoo Temple, the new Nauvoo Temple. And he goes to the cornerstone and he taps it and says, this is for you, Elijah Abel, first African-American person ordained in the Melchizedek priesthood in the Restoration, and taps it again, this is for you, Sister Jane. So that scene that hadn't happened when we wrote the first novel, we documented when we did the third novel. The adventure of all of this, of using the empathetic imagination, of being a partner with Darius, and then realizing it is time now actually to step back. For me, the B1 celebration was my sign to this part is done. And I started different adventures. I'm in touch with Darius a few times a month, but he's doing other things, and the things that the Lord intended to be in place are in place. Things we could not have imagined when we started our books in '98, things that happened at BYU that resulted in statements that were very clear about teachings of racism, and then finally the essay, the priesthood essay, that disavows the things that people in my generation were taught just almost capriciously. What a great thing that was. Now if people would just read it, and I mean that sincerely, we've talked about how many people know the essay exists, how many people have read the essay, and the big one is, have their hearts changed? How do you exercise empathetic imagination if there's something in your heart that doesn't let you go next door to meet your neighbor? I just keep hearing reverberations of your presentation, Lita and Kevin's, A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. But this earth is our neighborhood.
Where can people get the essays to read it?
So, you go to LDS.org, Gospel Topics, and it's race and priesthood. That's your link.
It's in the Gospel Library, actually, too, I believe.
Yeah, I think they've made it more accessible. When it first came up, it was a little difficult to find. On my computer, if I start RA, it says race and priesthood. Yeah, that one. So if you haven't read it, it becomes really important because the folklore does continue. There has to be a mammoth effort to stop language that hurts our brothers and sisters. I keep going back to 4th Nephi, where there are no ites and they are all one. They cannot bear that one of their brothers and sisters not have what they have, so there are no poor among them. The love that exists is such that there is complete harmony until envyings, strifes begin again, and finally one part of the population is destroyed. And the other population is left as a remnant and given the records ultimately that will help bring a unification. And it's written for our day. And the fact that race is an issue in the Book of Mormon means that there's a message for us there. I see it as, I see the whole Book of Mormon as having the climactic moments when the Savior calls everyone to him to touch his wounds. And everybody understands that they are all one. This is one flesh. This is family. There should never have been divisions. we do it ourselves. We find reasons to differ from each other and to hate each other and kill each other. That to me is what the Book of Mormon is all about. From the very beginning, right when we're introduced to the fighting between the brothers, and we understand the whole time they are brothers. The generations down, they are cousins, and they're killing each other. I think that's my last slide. No, I have this one. I need to mention her. This is by Elspeth Young. It is not necessarily Jane James. Many of you have seen this in the temple. It was when I was at the temple dedication in Kinshasa, DR Congo, and one of the things I did was I always check out the art when I'm in a temple. And one of my big questions was, will they have this? Elspeth Young did this beautiful painting, and somebody said, that's Jane Manning James, right? And she said, oh, sure. So she can be Jane, and a lot of people refer to her as Jane. But I went throughout that temple to see, do you have the black man ordaining his son? Yes. Do you have Jane? Yes. Do you have black mother and child? Yes. Because I want my Congolese brothers and sisters to see themselves when they come out of that temple. I want them to, everything in it. I'm eager to have a black cast, an African cast for the temple film. I think that will happen at some point. Lita, why don't you come back up and let's open to questions.
Okay.
We've got 10 minutes, just so you
We've
got time.
Yeah, we're going to open to questions, and it's said that we were going to present on black pioneers in general, but we actually were told to keep it to Jane, just one woman. We do know things about other black pioneers if you want to ask. But
I'm gonna ask.
yes, which would you like to know
I
about?
don't know, tell me.
Well, I'll tell you about Biddy Smith Mason, who was actually not LDS.
She's amazing.
So she was a slave, and you may not realize that some slaves came west with the pioneers. That can be a little disconcerting, can't it? She was with 13 of her siblings. I should say they were necessarily siblings, but they considered themselves all family. They were just called the Smith slaves. They came, she was like a sheep herder as they came west. Did you ever think that they had livestock and they didn't just buy it all when they came to Utah? They actually shepherded the animals while they were on their way, and that was what Biddy did. So at a certain point, 1850, does that ring bells to historians? What significant things happened in 1850? Oh, well, I'll just tell you. Fugitive Slave Act, which means that any black person can be, if somebody says he was my slave and he belongs to me in Georgia, that can happen anywhere. Anthony Burns in Boston, who is a slave who's run away, is taken back into slavery despite the protests of the entire town. Fugitive Slave Act is a horrific thing and really points us to the Civil War, which will, of course, break out a decade later. But then the California Compromise. California is declared a free state. Utah and, what's the other? I can't remember. Utah is given popular sovereignty where it can decide whether it would be free or slaveholding. What do you think it decides? Decides to be slaveholding. Yeah. But California's free. And there's gold there. You know, the gold rush happens, so Robert Smith decides that they will go to California. The rumor is that he is facing some real poverty and thinks that if he sells his slaves, that he'll be able to have his wealth restored. So he's in California, and as far as the slaves are concerned, they're free. They have stepped into free territory. Well, they are finally put into jail for protection, and the case goes to court. It goes to a judge named Benjamin Hayes. Remarkable man who you can read about, and he kept really good journals, which is why we have the story I'm going to tell you now. So Judge Hayes is there with 14. They are not allowed to testify in court because the law says that no black person can testify in an open court. So they're back in his chambers. And rather than just going along with, this is what the law says, so sorry, we won't be able to hear your side of the story, he takes them in the chambers and goes around and says, what are your feelings? We are told that you want to remain Robert Smith's slaves. Is this true? And they categorically say, absolutely not. And Biddy says, I have feared that since I first arrived. And then Judge Hayes goes into open court and publicly declares the Smith slaves free and free forever. So Robert Smith goes to Texas. The Smith slaves are free, but then a month later, Judge Hayes writes about an event that happened where his little boy was running into the road and a carriage was approaching, ready to hit the little boy, and one of the same slaves who he had just emancipated rescues his little boy. And Judge Hayes is writing a letter to his friend and says, can you imagine how Providence has paid me back for what I did? I was regarded as an abolitionist. I was cursed all the way from Sacramento, but God saved my little boy. And because I've researched his life, I know that his wife died shortly thereafter. This was his only little boy. And one of the people who he emancipated saved him. That whole idea of saving each other and offering the gospel to each other, that is what we're about, healing each other. That's really why we've gathered. We're doing it through art right now, but that really is why we're here. So there's a story for you. Other questions? I really want Lita. I just think that Lita has Jane's spirit with her, so I want her to be a big part of this. Questions for Lita?
I'll get Joe for asking this question, but I'd love for Lita to talk about, she played Jane in the movie, and what was that like?
Yes.
The movie's coming out soon.
That I'm not sure. Because I don't know what happened to the movie. But it's called Green Flake. And he's another one of those blacks. And he was a slave, and he came west, and he was driving Brigham Young's carriage. Well, I think it was called a carriage, but his wagon. And he was with Brigham when Brigham said, this is the place. He was driving that. So why don't we know about him? So since the B1 acknowledgement of
What's
everyone.
the B1? Some people may not know that.
Did you? Okay, if you can go on YouTube and look up, what's it under?
You just put in B1.
Your B1, and it was the celebration that marked the 40th anniversary of the restriction lifted, that already been good.
In the big conference center.
Yes.
Right.
And let's just say, Kevin was one of the ones who choreographed the African dances and the diaspora, and myself and two of my daughters were in the choir. So I don't know if you saw it. Who saw it? Okay, so I don't know how you felt when you saw it. What did you feel when you saw it?
Celebration.
Celebration. Okay, anything else?
It was one of the most powerful experiences I've had at church.
At church. Whoa! Okay, but let me say, what y'all experienced watching it on TV,
Oh, I was there.
you were there. Okay, so you were on TV, right? And you were there. Can you witness with me, night and that? If you were in that room, the heavens were open. We have rehearsed this a few times, and Kevin was rehearsing with the dancers, and the choir would rehearse with Gladys. And the narrators would say their parts. But that night, there were angels, there were spirits that were present that we all felt. And it was at that moment I said, okay, something is starting. And it wasn't, hey, it's the 40th anniversary. It's like, it is time.
Mm-hmm.
Everything that Mark said, it is time for this kingdom to move forward in a way that we don't understand at this point. So, Green.
And to see President Nelson, Oaks, and Iron standing up and rocking to South was a beautiful sight.
Yeah, yeah.
Bring it on.
It was absolutely that space that we all want to experience and see and embrace throughout, not only the church, but this world. But I was invited to be a part of this movie called Green Flake. To tell Green Flake, first name Green, last name is Flake. And I really kind of resisted because of just experience that I've had, and I just didn't know in my life that this is something that I needed to do. But I felt led to go to the audition. First of all, I don't like auditions anymore. I used to love it, but auditions are just like, you gotta sell yourself. And I just don't want to do that. The only thing worth selling is the gospel of Jesus Christ. So come here. But I went to that audition and I knew. And I literally said to them, I am Jane. I don't know who else auditioned, but I am her. And so I went and I did this film, and it was recent, it was in December, a year and a half ago. And I swear I never felt the cold, and that's huge for my husband, because you look at me right now, and I still have a thermal and everything else on. But she was with me, and what I have learned, and even that was confirmed to me again as Margaret was talking, I've had some things I've had to heal from, racially, and in my relationships, and things that I didn't understand, and friends. Josie Ann, who played Jane that she showed you, she's not in church anymore. These people are leaving. And so I was struggling with that. And what I come to understand as I pray to my Father in heaven to give me, change my heart, give me a different heart, help me to understand and love. Jane comes into my life. I have an understanding and a witness. She is helping to heal me. My heart is not where it was anymore. My heart is different. I know how to love. I know how to offer that simple bread to people because I have Jane to look to. And that is something that we all have. And please, may the heavens open that we can understand her more and see her life so we can know that this is also a symbol of my sister, to my sister, to my brother. But that is something that I don't know what happened with it, but I just know that I needed to do it. I needed to be her voice again. I needed to be her face. And there were things that were written on the script, and I would be in trouble maybe, but things that were written in the script, and that is not what I would say.
Oh,
I would change it.
wow.
And I'd get in front of the camera and I'd do it and I'd speak it. And the writers, I don't know if they knew or not, but they just like, but I think maybe that is one of the reasons why she had me do it, because I had to represent her truth. I had to stand in her feet so that her voice can be heard. So I don't know what's happening, but again, my heart is continually healing. Yes.
Who's producing that movie?
His name, he's a Bonner man, and I can't remember his name.
He's a director from LA, and
Yes.
just to let you know, I talked to him. When she told, can you imagine going to an audition and saying, I'm Jane? They didn't cast her at first.
They did?
They cast someone else.
Oh.
The other person fell through, and the director said, I guess Lita was right. So they
Oh.
called her and
It's
gave her
Jane.
the part.
Yeah, it was Jane.
Oh.
Nope, it's Lita. Yeah.
So they're probably in editing mode, but when you start to hear Reflect, just know that's the film about.
And I guess it's just, I don't know, just my attitude, but I just thought I did it. And then I just, because that's the only thing I knew needed to happen. I just needed to play her. All that other stuff, I just kind of went on to the next thing. Until, again, I don't know if it's gonna happen again, but I know she's not done, and I'm not done.
That was gonna be my question.
Yeah.
What's next? It's so exciting. But like, what is next? What can we do? What can we read? What can we look forward to that?
I just recently wrote an article for Dialogue that's coming out, I don't know when, because I don't know when the spring issue comes out. But the article is called Symbols on Canvas. And it's kind of like another tribute to women in art. But I mention her. I talk about her experience and the inequalities and the things that she experienced and how she couldn't get to the temple. And one of the things I say is that I go to the temple because I can, and I also go because she couldn't. Mm-hmm. So it's those things. Yeah, search and Google and figure out these people. And what Kevin and I just shared, there's so many other Black members of the church whose voices we don't know, and we need to.
Yes. Because you're in music and dance, are there any
insights into the new hymnal? Will there be some more music that?
I know they're being submitted. I know they
Yeah,
are
gospel
submitted, but I don't know who's on the committee to choose them.
Okay. I'm looking forward to it.
But thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Is there a resource that people can go and look and see these Black Latter-day Saints? Like the University of Utah has the Paul Reed has a website, right?
All of the information that Kevin used today with the Century of Mormons was from Paul Reed. Yeah, it was the Century of Mormons. And that was just the females, part of the females. There were families and there were men, and we were like, oh my gosh. And men who have a priesthood, and just truths that we get to learn about and understand and add to our own testimonies. Because we can't grow, we can't rise, and we said, until we're all rising together.
Yes, yes, perfect. All right, that was the perfect conclusion right there.